We'll try. We'll give it a try. We'll see. We'll see how this works out. Let me pull up my notes here. I'm here with one of these kind of videos. I was talking to my brother today, and he introduced me to a concept that I found really, really fascinating. So I just dug into it and learned some about it and figured I'd just share what I learned because I thought it was interesting. I was commenting on the prices of gas, as everyone is, because they're high. It's sort of like, what's the solution? What's the solution to this problem of energy? So what we do know is one of the most efficient ways, unfortunately or not, is nuclear reactors. In terms of the energy it produces is pretty much incomparable. But there's like the problem with the Fukushima meltdown, and then also obviously Chernobyl has just shown that nuclear reactors are dangerous, and they have proven that to some pretty catastrophic and tragic results. The other aspect is there's so much regulation around nuclear reactors, both from the safety of what I just talked about, but also because it requires uranium and plutonium, which are two things that create nuclear weapons. As my brother pointed out to me, there's a solution to this issue. It's known as thorium molten salt reactors. They are real, and they were actually proven to work a long time ago, back in the 50s and 60s during the Cold War, and all this was being researched.
Strongly indicated that molten salt breeder reactors operating on a thorium cycle could be developed to produce low-cost electricity.
However, to give you a little bit of background on that, at the time of the Cold War, they needed to create plutonium in order to create nuclear weapons. They knew that they wanted nuclear bombs. That requires plutonium. Now, plutonium doesn't exist naturally in nature, so you have to create it. And what can you use to create plutonium is uranium. So there was a lot of interest in utilizing uranium to create energy and then also create plutonium, which would help build, specifically for the United States, a very significant amount of nuclear arms. During this same time, they were also messing around with thorium because you could also create a reactor out of it. It's found in abundance on Earth, and essentially when you see the stuff of sci-fi from back when they kind of projected what the future would look like in that nuclear way, they were theorizing all that energy would be created with these salt reactors. So that's how you see, like, for example, in Fallout, how there's a reactor inside of each robot, and there's a reactor inside of cars and planes, and that was all theorized with the idea of using salt reactors, which was thorium and not uranium. It was sort of a battle of the bands, and thorium lost, and it lost a lot of funding at the same time, so there were some issues that weren't able to get worked out with it, which we'll get to in a second. But in order to, I guess, sort of really understand why thorium is so much better is to understand that, well, obviously you know that the current uranium reactor is very dangerous, as we've seen historically. So in the traditional uranium reactor, there are rods containing uranium that heat up water, and it creates a tremendous amount of pressure, and that pressure creates steam, which then obviously creates the energy that can go into power lines. But the problem is that if that water ever gets too hot or the pressure fluctuates, it can create hydrogen, lots of hydrogen, which unfortunately is an explosive material, and that releases all of the radioactive material into the air, the water supply, you know the rest. But with a salt reactor, it uses a mixture of liquid thorium that is known as molten salt, and that molten salt heats up itself, and it operates in regular pressure. So there's really no explosive aspect to this. And what's even more interesting is that the way that thorium works, if the material gets too hot, it deactivates its ability to have a reaction and to create energy. So it kills it and it'll cool itself back down. So it pretty much is self-regulated. These reactors were proven to work back in the 60s, but there's essentially two major hurdles that they couldn't get over given the time, you know, being the 60s, was that over decades, that thorium could disintegrate the metal that housed it, but that's been solved because of new alloys that have been discovered in the past few decades. The other issue was that there wasn't a proper way to measure the high pressures and high temperatures that were going on inside of these tanks, but with, again, the kind of advent of modern technology, that's been somewhat solved as well. Or, well, it has been solved. It's been solved. Now, in order to really see this realized, at least for a legitimate source of energy for the United States, the government has not pursued this, but there are a couple private companies that have attempted to pursue building one of these reactors. However, once again, there's a lot of regulation due to the reasons I stated earlier, so they're forced to look at different options. And one of those companies, in fact, is actually entertaining the idea of having a mobile, the reactor will be on a boat, on a ship that will sit out in the ocean, down in the Indonesian Ocean. But the kind of newly developed, or from what I understand, the newly developed interesting thing about these salt reactors is China is currently building not one but two giant ones in the desert. They have had a very small one in operation since 2011. I assume it's been successful if they're scaling up. The nice thing about these reactors is they don't require a water source, which is really important. It doesn't require any water. So they're gonna build them in the desert, because if something were to go wrong, some unforeseen issue, I don't know if you've looked at Google Maps lately, but where there's water, there's lots of people. And so if something goes wrong, it's a little bit less tragic, less catastrophe going on. I'm sure there are kinks to this that I'm not understanding or seeing, issues with this, and it's not a political thing. It's just very interesting because, my brother and I were talking about, I think whoever gets to this energy solution first is going to be somewhat of a god. So China's already looking at the idea of, or it's theorized that they're looking at the idea of building these in other countries, and just providing energy to other countries. So it'll give a ton of political influence, and it'll potentially solve their pollution problem. It could potentially solve, or put a dent or just change the course of global warming, if you will. I just was kind of blown away by this because it seems like a really perfect solution, at least for now, to the energy issue, because we are obviously demanding more and more energy, and it's an unstoppable train. So we just have to find a solution to it. And the fact that there's this, I don't know, it's worth looking into. I think it's cool. If you're interested in this, look it up. Look it up. It's cool. That's it.